Thanks for tuning in to Asymmetrical Haircuts. To help us keep doing this show, please look at our support us page on the website where you can find our Patreon and our newsletter.
Yeah, that's where we discuss our War Criminals book club. We do reviews, and just for the price of a cup of coffee, you can support us.
These harms like severe psychological suffering that can come from having your torture live streamed. Think of those Palestinian detainees if their family sees those videos. It's really hard to scrub those from the internet. They're probably going to be out there forever. And then you're having all these people see that video, especially if you know you're being filmed. That's a really degrading thing.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
So it's a pleasure to welcome back today with us Sarah Zarmsky, now lecturer at Queen's University Belfast Law School. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
So Sarah was last on our pod discussing virtual reality. God, that was a wacky podcast, wasn't it, Steph?
Yeah, today is going to be a kind of equally up in the air podcast in the sense that it's going to be all about cyber, digital, and who better to talk to us about this than an open source investigator turned academic. And she's going to hopefully talk us through the challenge of digitally sourced evidence in relation to international crimes. So that's your brief for today. I see a petrified nod, so we're going to see how this goes.
So really, for me at least, it's this sense of a brave new world. We know that courts are now using open source or digital evidence for prosecution. We saw, for example, the International Criminal Court when it was reporting to the Security Council of the United Nations about its progress and processes for Libya. This was back in 2022. It was talking about the new funds that it has. It was enhancing in-house technology, also had a fund that had specialized capacity and called it the Harmony Project, strengthening the technical foundations of evidence processing using the Microsoft Azure product suite. Also talking in that about artificial intelligence, machine learning. And of course, if we think back again on Libya, there was also an arrest warrant against al-Verfali, a Libyan military officer, and the charges against him were heavily based on videos which were posted on Facebook, which, now that I've said all that stuff about artificial intelligence, sounds decidedly old school. What else can you remember, Steph, in this world?
Well, earlier this year, the prosecution asked for input for a new draft policy on cybercrimes. And we've seen the Mali cases where we saw digital evidence. Al-Mahdi used satellite images, which is also fairly old school, but also geolocation tools and other digital evidence which helped establish the location and timing and in some cases the nature of the crimes. And in the Al-Hassan case, they had some kind of advanced interactive platform which was used to present evidence in court, and it let judges and witnesses kind of view and see crime scenes digitally, integrating video footage and spatial data to provide a comprehensive picture of the crimes committed. Now, we have a lot of different terminology here, also cyber crimes or cyber-enabled crimes, and we're going to talk about some definitions.
Well, already we seem to be suggesting that the world has already moved on, but we've already got a ton of different bits of terminology, digital, cyber-enabled. So I thought maybe we could just start off with Sarah and say, what on earth are we talking about here, Sarah? Can you give us some definitions, please, for these poor journalists who are trying to understand?
I can try my best. First, these terms are defined in that first part of that draft policy. So I don't have it in front of me, but there are definitions for cyber-enabled crimes. It seems to say that it's electronic or digital technologies throughout the piece, it seems, which one of the comments that I submitted a few comments to the consultation, and one of them was I was a bit confused as well what they meant by cyber-enabled crimes, because it seems to not really focus on digital technologies that wouldn't necessarily use the internet or like cyberspace, because in my mind, I kind of think of the cyber as being internet's like cyberspace, but there are technologies, maybe more old school ones, but still technologies that aren't necessarily connected to the cyberspace. So I think that definitely needs to be clarified once the policy is made into the final version. But for me in my work, I tend to focus on digital harms, and I use that word because harms kind of encompasses sort of the wrongfulness of these acts. A lot of the things that I talk about aren't necessarily crimes under international criminal law yet, or even domestic criminal laws, so you can't really call them crimes. So I use the word harm because that has this connotation of wrongfulness.
But digital harms to me suggests that it's harm done via digital means. But you don't mean that. You mean that harm that's kind of captured digitally.
Yeah, so I do mean harm done through digital means, but like when I talk about it, I think like, for example, a digital harm could be intrusive mass surveillance or online sexual violence. So there's a wide spectrum of these digital harms, and I think the word digital can sometimes be better than a term like cyber or electronic or things like that, because it can kind of, in my mind, encompass things that aren't necessarily just like in the online space. So online harms, which we see a lot if you think of like the online harms bill that was pretty famous in the UK, that refers to harms through online means, but digital harms would encompass that and other harms through digital technologies.
Already the ICC is looking at situations where they have this digital evidence, and there is also a kind of cyber of digital harms included. If we talk about Palestine, for instance, we had, Janet has here Stephopedia in the script, which I'm not going to Stephopedia that much, but last year in November, the court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Gaza conflict. And even though we don't know the exact content of what he submitted to judges, we have seen some of the evidence that the expert commission reviewed, and they seem to rely a lot on videos and digital evidence, and also of messages on Facebook and Twitter. If you look at the kind of digital aspect of it, what strikes you in the Palestine investigation?
In the Palestine context, I think, there's been a proliferation of online content that's coming out of particularly Israeli soldiers that are posting videos online. There was a proliferation of content in the Syria context and in Ukraine, but I think now the sheer volume of information that just comes out every day on like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, everything is just so much more than what I've seen for other conflicts, even like from the start to the finish of the PhD I just did, which was, kind of starting off, and that's kind of when Ukraine and Russia kicked off, and then ending it was after October 7th. And, you kind of saw the big change, I think, and there was just so much more content. I think another key difference is Israeli soldiers do tend to use social media videos to further degrade Palestinians and I think spread propaganda. We see like the official Israeli accounts posting things that could be seen as memes or like trolling posts. You see that from IDF soldiers as well. There's a particular example that I wrote about in a blog post on Opinio Juris a few months ago. There were Palestinian detainees that were bound and they had no clothes on, and this Israeli soldier was filming it and put like this Instagram filter on it that was like showing money being thrown, like, like little clip art money and things like that. So it's just this really seemingly intense desire to dehumanize the victims in the footage and kind of spread this message that's quite, racist and dehumanizing. So I think that is a big thing that came out of this that we just see a lot more now, given the rise of new technologies.
Janet breaking in here. Now, after the recording, Sarah got in touch with some corrections to her description of this video. So to be precise, it is a video posted by an IDF reservist and actually shows him throwing real money at a detainee. And the footage also has an added Instagram sticker overlay of a praying Israeli soldier. So now back to our episode.
And we had this whole thing where then Israeli soldiers were told to stop posting because you have these organizations that are trying to get them prosecuted under universal jurisdiction. There's an organization in Belgium, I think the Hind Arab Foundation is trying to do that. Did you also see kind of a decline after it was obvious that that is being used, or are they just still posting with the same abandon?
I think there has been a bit of a decline. I mean, I'm not closely monitoring it as someone who would be, specifically working on that would be. I think generally I've seen less since then, but that also makes me a bit concerned that, and I am sort of thinking about this for maybe future research is kind of what do we do like once we stop telling them to do these things? What if they figure out something else, right? So there was this example I know in the situation of Xinjiang in China, they had like these mass internment camps that they were building, and we were able to, I think it was like a commission of inquiry or something, was able to see that they had built those through satellite imagery. So when they started kind of naming and shaming and calling this out and putting it in those reports, then that declined. So they actually stopped using that so much and building those camps so much. But then we know that they then implemented more things like the mass surveillance of Uyghurs inside their homes, a lot of other crackdowns that maybe happened as a result of that. So I think sometimes when we crack down on behaviors, they just develop new behaviors that we might not anticipate. So I do wonder if we're telling them not to post things, are they just doing something else and what will come of that later?
I'm wondering also whether you're talking, Sarah, also about a different type of crime from the crimes that we've seen prosecuted so far, and crimes that are done on a digital basis. So they are the same crimes. They could be a crime against humanity, they could be a war crime, but they are specifically using the digital space to allegedly commit those crimes. And can you run through how that works? I'm obviously must be the first person to ever think of this. So, tell me, where else is this happening? Who else is thinking about it? And how is this going?
There's so many examples. So, yes, I think digital harms, which is something that I've argued throughout my work and just finished a PhD on. Essentially, this hopefully book that will come out argues that these digital harms are severe enough, grave enough, and should be thought of as international crimes like we normally have thought of, like crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. But there are different means of perpetration. And of course, you don't want to stretch by analogy too much, because then you get into, the rights of the accused being infringed upon, or, fairness and things like that. So, of course, like within the confines of meeting the definitions of crimes, you'd want to apply those. But I think, there's also where we don't have that and where we would be stretching it too much. We might need to develop some new crimes that could encompass digital harms. So I focus on 4 examples in my work so far, which would be kind of sharing footage of crimes online. So kind of what we just talked about. Digital mass surveillance, I kind of encompass that as digital threats to democracy in a way. Online sexual violence and online hate speech and disinformation. So I think there are more categories in that. There's different ways to classify it, but that's how I've been thinking about it in my work so far.
When you're talking about online sexual violence, is that like rape threats or sharing footage of sexual abuse?
Yeah, so this can be a bunch of things. I think something like a rape threat wouldn't necessarily meet the gravity threshold, or wouldn't necessarily be something we see yet, at least at like the ICC. Focusing on an ICC context, there are, different ways, for instance, of committing crimes of selling women and girls into sexual slavery. So if you use like an online marketplace, you could also be posting their photos and their biographical data and things online to the people who are going to, like, quote, buy those people.
Which is what happened in ISIS, apparently,
Yeah,
right?
so we have that. There is also, you could see how like sharing footage of people who are nude, even if it's not necessarily in a sexual context, could be seen as a form of sexual violence. There's also different ways of committing gender and sexuality-based persecution. For instance, ISIS has this horrible practice of throwing gay men off of buildings in executions and posting those videos online to persecute the gay community more and, instill fear in that sense. So there's a variety of ways that you could be committing sexual and gender-based violence using digital technologies. And I think this might be a good segue to point out that what I thought was most shocking about this draft policy on cyber-enabled crimes is not once is sexual violence mentioned. Not once sexual gender. Those words are just like, if you do a control F, it doesn't come up. And I thought that was pretty shocking, because there's so much in the world, even if you're not looking at ICL, if you think about like deep fake, revenge porn, stuff like that, you see that being criminalized in domestic jurisdictions. It's clearly a really hot topic. It really surprised me that it didn't even come up in the policy.
Especially since it's such a focal point for the OTP in the last year. I don't think they've done actually anything that didn't mention sexual and gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm. And I really hope that we do see that when they have the complete final policy, because I think putting it out there would be obviously an expressive form of law. These policy documents are, and like putting that out there would be really helpful.
I know it might be difficult to comment from the outside, but how well set up is an organization like the ICC to actually deal with this kind of evidence?
I mean, that's hard to say, like you said, from an outside perspective. I mean, we see a lot of progress in the sense that, you know, they have that Project Harmony, they've set up OTP Link, they have apparently AI tools that can help them sift through content that comes in and organize it. I do have some work coming out with a colleague, Judy Mionki, who is ICL Defense Counsel at various international criminal courts and tribunals, that talks about, in part, maybe the fair trial implications of using these types of technologies, and like, you know, whether the defense counsel, for instance, would have access to OTP Link, whether they have access to those tools to sort through the content. And then just the sheer proliferation of content. I think it said that they had 50,000 submissions or something already. So even if you're acting in good faith, it could still be very possible that you miss exonerating information or something and don't hand it over to the defense. So I think in terms of how like the court functions and thinking about broader goals of the court and justice and rights of the accused, rights of victims as well, I'm not sure how well set up it is. It seems like the OTP is really progressing ahead with these new technologies, but I do worry that that could leave some larger gaps.
We have this thing with the OTP and having this project with Microsoft, this Azure project, and we've already seen some issues with the court and sanctions by Microsoft. They disabled the prosecutor's email address, his ICC work email address, when he was sanctioned. Do you think the court also addresses enough the risks of where they store their evidence? Do you have any idea of their digital infrastructure? Because if you're working with Microsoft, I'm assuming all your Azure stuff is on US servers, which, you know, now with the current administration that we have, may be unsure if the court could get to it.
Yeah, I definitely have that as a major concern as well. I think it's using Microsoft. I mean, the court needs to kind of take what it can get in the sense, and like a partnership like that with such a big company with advanced technology, it can be a positive thing, but it does seem to be sort of have a monopoly on the court in that sense. And it does strike me as weird that we're using these main US-based companies, given the US sentiment towards the ICC. I think we saw the other day as well that there was another cyber attack at the ICC. So it does seem to be happening. I also think, you know, their AI tools are also worth questioning. So Relativity One, I think the tool that they use for sifting through data, does have partnerships with OpenAI. So I do wonder about the software that is being used to sift through the content, because if that's the same thing as OpenAI, then they'd just be taking that data somehow. Like, even if we have some sort of confidentiality agreement or something, right, it is collecting that data at the end of the day. And that's a lot of vulnerable witnesses and, you know, vulnerable things just being fed into a system like that, which is quite concerning.
Yeah, and we've seen examples of information that's collected and then it's said is not being used, but then still somebody seems to be looking at it. I think we just had, Google, if you go in incognito mode, it would still record what you're doing or things like that. And then I'm not saying that OpenAI is doing the same, but giving all that information to this machine, who knows?
I'm also wondering, you know, this is an oldie, but I think still a goodie, is the question around whether digital evidence as put onto social media platforms gets stored correctly, whether it gets retained correctly. What I have noticed is a proliferation of other organizations before it gets to the ICC, that there's a ton of organizations out there collecting stuff. And I'm wondering how their protocols are working, and whether you're aware that everybody is working according to a particular way of collecting material and storing it, so that we don't lose stuff, but that we also don't put people at risk.
I obviously don't know the logistics of every one of those organizations. And part of this new digital world is we have a lot more actors and non-state actors, especially working with the court. And, you know, a major part of these are these organizations that are specialized in looking at open source content, verifying it, storing it, things like that. I think it would be beneficial for, I'm not sure how it works, but for each of those to have memoranda of understanding with the court that would set up the channels for information sharing and, the actual expectations of what's going to go on to kind of standardize it more. I'm not sure what they have in place right now or if they just send things like communications to the prosecutor, for instance. But I do think we do have tools that are developed by other organizations and initiatives. So we have the Berkeley Protocol, the Leiden Guidelines, the Evaluating Open Source Guide for Judges that I worked on that are made by these other groups that I do think a lot of these organizations are aware of, and those kind of help to standardize the procedure. But yeah, I think one of the issues that we're facing is, it's great that we have all these organizations that want to help the court, but then they're not all lawyers. They're not all trained in how that evidence should be preserved. Some are, and they're great. Like Mnemonic, for instance, does great work in preserving content. But that kind of thing of, do these people have the adequate training, knowledge? Are they able to give the court evidence in a way that it could be used in a courtroom and not just for maybe other purposes like journalism or something like that?
And the follow-up to that from me would be whether people are sufficiently trained in some kind of survivor-centered approach and really providing information sufficiently to those they're collecting the information from or about how the material is going to be used.
Yeah, so on that point, there is a great initiative. I think the draft is posted online by the Murad code that's been updated for open source practitioners. So this is just in the context of conflict, sexual and gender-based violence. But some people at the IICI and the Berkeley Human Rights Center updated the Murad code essentially to take into account ethical considerations for doing open source research when you come across sexual violence content. So that kind of thing can definitely be helpful. But I do think there is this kind of question overall of whether we're doing more harm than good sometimes. I try to think of the do no harm principle with my work. Sometimes I'm wondering if content actually needs to be shared. Do we actually need to be posting this video? Do we need to look at this video? How many lawyers on my team need to actually see it? Do we need to show it in a courtroom, for instance? I think these are some victim-centered, survivor-centered approaches, like you said, that would be quite beneficial, especially when you have footage and victims might have to relive some of that trauma. So I think these considerations, because they haven't really come up so much in terms of digital content yet with the ICC, would need to be thought of in the future.
What do you think then of this? We had this with one of the Mali trials where they're recreated and you can walk through the evidence. This is something that the OTP and lawyers are really enthusiastic about because they can walk judges through where it happened. When we had our VR episode, we talked about how what happens in VR is just as real to your brain as what happens in reality. So do you think there's a risk of extra traumatizing victims again in the courtroom if you make them walk through these kind of mock-ups or do things like that?
Yeah, of course. Also, while of course that's true about virtual reality and virtual environments, walking through them can be re-traumatizing. Most of these platforms, like the platform, I'm thinking particularly of the Sandinaya prison platform from Amnesty International from a few years ago, but that's all made from victims' voices and people retelling their stories. So a lot of these platforms are also made through people going over and over again their stories again with authorities or whoever's making them. So that in itself can also be quite traumatic, and balancing whether that platform would really help the prosecution in a way that would, if we just had the victims say their story once, because it probably has to go on and on with that level of detail that's incorporated into those platforms. I also think it's important to, even outside of the courtroom and outside of ICL, maybe how journalists or other people, academics, how we talk about these things in the media matters. That can also be re-traumatizing or dehumanizing in a sense to victims. I've seen the term, for instance, some colleagues have used the term war influencer for the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, which absolutely no disrespect to those colleagues. Everyone has their own different ways of talking about things. And I do get the appeal of using that term of someone sharing footage of crimes online. And you can kind of see what they're getting at there. They want to do this for maybe glory or something like that. But for me, that term is quite problematic for two reasons. I think one, it is dehumanizing. And so in my work, I do really think that it's important to say what it is. I'm not saying this is a war influencer video. I'm saying this is a video of an ISIS execution or of a beheading, because I think the victims in that video deserve the severity and the language to show that how bad that really is, and really the respect that comes with saying that. And then I also think we also run this risk of propaganda spurring more crimes, or more, maybe not people who commit the crimes, but you see people go down rabbit holes and conspiracy and like get into these like right wing or terrorist agendas pretty quickly nowadays. So if we're calling something, this TikTok video is done by a war influencer, does that maybe for some, could you picture like a teenage boy being like, oh, that's cool, let me go look up that video. But then you're degrading that victim in the video further by having more people drawn to that footage. So I also think what I'm getting at with all of this is that I think the labels that we use to describe these new phenomena in a digital environment are really important. And I think we need to not detract from the severity or gravity of what they are, because a lot of times I think we think that stuff in the digital environment isn't as grave because it's not like a physical killing or concentration camp. And I'm not saying that it is as grave, but I do think we should be thinking of it as more serious than we sometimes do, because these harms, like severe psychological suffering that can come from having your torture live streamed, or you seeing, think of those Palestinian detainees, if their family sees those videos, it's really hard to scrub those from the internet. They're probably going to be out there forever. And then you're having all these people see that video, especially if you know you're being filmed. That's a really degrading thing. And I think that's also why this has been prosecuted at domestic courts. So there's been different war crimes cases in like the Netherlands, Germany, Finland, and Sweden, I believe, or some, where people have actually been sentenced to the war crime of outrages upon personal dignity for just the separate crime that they did in the video was also prosecuted as like a physical thing, but in and of itself, just filming it and posting it online has been prosecuted as a crime as well and resulted in convictions.
So we're chatting to you now, Sarah, as you're passing through The Hague. Thank you for dropping in. And this is the middle of July, and we'll probably process this in the next month or so. Will we see a actual policy out from the ICC sort of by the end of the year, do you think, or should we be looking for it towards next year?
I honestly have no idea, but I would think maybe by the end of the year, given how quickly it's moving and how quickly it frankly needs to move.
Do you think whatever draft policy is there is maybe not already obsolete by the time it goes out? I mean, technology, now I'm really sounding very old. I'm sounding all of my 50 years. Technology is really moving very fast. So I can see that in the way that it accelerates with Reuters, for instance, how we use this new technology and digital stuff. Is it even possible to write a policy on it?
I will say one thing that I think that the draft policy does well is it doesn't necessarily prescribe certain technologies or like name certain situations that this applies to. Like I think it keeps it vague enough where we could expand it to new technologies that will inevitably develop. So I do think it is worded in such a way, it could be improved in some parts, but it's worded in a way that would allow it to be a living and flexible policy. I think, honestly, the Rome Statute is as well. I think a lot of times people, traditional international criminal law lawyers, don't want to maybe expand things by analogy, or they get scared, and you can't do that. It's prohibited in the statute. But they get scared that applying these crimes to new modes of perpetration or having different crimes developed, for instance, that might infringe upon fundamental rights too much and stuff like that. But that's not what I'm arguing for. I think we have to be able to keep the law up with the times. And I do think that the Rome Statute in its preamble, and it is reflected that it's meant to be something that will focus on the worst crimes that are happening of the day in the world. And I do think that if we're going to keep up with that, if international criminal law has a chance at surviving, it does need to catch up with advances in technology, amongst other things.
So we're going to wrap this up. We always end with our asymmetrical haircuts questions. And the first one is always, what didn't we ask you that you really want to tell us about this subject, or something you want to lift from the conversation, or you're like the key point that you want to get across to people who are listening to this?
That's a big question. I think generally I've said everything that I've wanted to say, but just as the general takeaway, I think it would be something along the lines of what I just said, which is that we do need to catch up international criminal law and honestly all law to technological times. And that should be done in a way that respects the rights of the accused, respects other fundamental liberties. But it is doable, and I don't think that we should necessarily give up on ICL just yet.
And we always are now asking our in-person interviewees if you have a court case, or particularly connected to international criminal justice, that you really like talking about, maybe one that you're already using with your students in Belfast, maybe one that always comes to mind when you've got a glass of wine in your hand and thinking about the work that you're doing. What do you like to rap about?
I don't know. I'm trying to think of something different because I remember the last time I was on this podcast, I think I answered this question with those domestic cases of prosecuting war crimes for filming and sharing footage of their crimes online. I think I do often come back to that in my work just because it's such a perfect example of what we could be doing in international criminal courts and tribunals, but we just haven't gotten there yet. I mean, there's so many cases that I can't really think of a specific ICL one.
And our final question is always, what are you reading, listening to, watching that you recommend, either that's in the field or something that you do to get away from international law?
God, I could go on for hours. So I just finished The Bear, the most recent season, which I really loved. Loved The Bear. I also just read Sunrise on the Reaping, the new Hunger Games book. That was very good. It's very traumatic, but it's very good. So I'm looking forward to that film. But yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for making the time to have a chat to us.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure as technologies develop and cases develop, we're going to keep checking in with you. And also, I need an excuse to come visit you in Belfast.
Yes, please do.
Okay. Thank you.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.